I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector News Podcast. And I have joining me, I have Scott Melbye of the American Uranium Producers Association. Welcome, Scott.
Hey, Mike, it's always good to be on your show. Lots going on.
There is a ton of stuff going on behind the scenes in the uranium and nuclear space. So let's start this off with the original reason for reaching out to you, which was to discuss the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, which I understand just nicely passed the Senate with a 96-3 vote. The bill is sponsored by Senator John Barrasso, a Republican out of Wyoming. And I know, can we still call him a Democrat, Senator Manchin from West Virginia?
Absolutely, yeah. I was just in his office on Friday when it was in the news that he was thinking about becoming an independent. So the phones are ringing off the hook, even though they're all away back in state for the August recess. But yeah, there has been a lot of developments on that. And just to kind of set the table, I mean, I think in our more recent interviews have talked about the bipartisan support that nuclear is receiving in terms of energy policy, not just in the United States, but Europe and elsewhere, and up in Canada as well. I think just that realization that nuclear's got to be a part of the mix if you're going to have any meaningful impact on carbon emissions, and we can't sacrifice reliable, affordable electricity in the process. So whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, it ticks the box for both. And so we've seen, as the Uranium Producers of America, we've seen a lot of activity on the Hill, and our two big priorities, I would say there's a third priority as well, but the first two are really the Russian uranium ban and the Nuclear Fuel Security Act. And the Russian uranium ban, it may surprise people that, we're now 18 months since the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, and we still haven't banned Russian uranium in the United States. And that's really just because our embarrassing dirty little secret is that we are very reliant on Russia for 20% of our enrichment, and close to 50% of our uranium comes from Russia and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So it's maybe understandable that that ban didn't come down too quickly. But I will say, having spent a lot of time on the Hill, there isn't a congressman, House or Senate, that doesn't agree that we should ban Russian uranium. I think they really want to make sure that we do it in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences on U.S. nuclear utilities and the reactors that rely on that nuclear fuel. So that's why there's two bills in play here. The Russian uranium bill is one separate initiative, and the Nuclear Fuel Security Act is another separate initiative, but they're related. And what the Nuclear Fuel Security Act does is it expands the strategic uranium reserve that our company, Uranium Energy Corp, was fortunate to be one of the recipients of awards there to supply uranium to the U.S. government earlier this year. But this bill would expand that program to be an enriched strategic uranium reserve and a high assay, low enriched strategic uranium reserve. The meaning behind that is that, this isn't just a uranium issue anymore. We're concerned about the refining, conversion, and enrichment. And if you lose Russia, which is 40% of global enrichment capacity, we had better be able to stand up our own industries. It doesn't have to be in the United States, but it does have to be in the West. So Canada, US, Western Europe are going to need to solve this problem. So the US Congress is saying, okay, we think that the industry doesn't need long-term subsidization or help anyway, but it does need a kickstart to get things back up, because if we're going to spend billions of dollars on these fuel cycle components, the companies want to know that this is a long-term U.S. strategy. We're not going to fall back on Russian needs in 2 or 3 years time. So hence the bill has made it through committees in both the House and Senate, and as you mentioned, passed in the Senate with a 96-3 vote right before the August recess as part of the NDAA, the National Defense Appropriations Act. What's significant there is that is known as a must-pass legislation. So when the House comes back after the August recess in early September, they're going to need to take up the NDAA and hopefully, their version contains these same principles. They've had bipartisan support of these two pieces of legislation. So really, it comes down to spending. It's no secret that the Republicans now in charge of the House are much more fiscally responsible and concerned about the government spending too much money. So everything's being scrutinized, with that filter. Good news is the House appropriations put forward a $2.7 billion price tag on this program, but they've also indicated that the funds could be reallocated, repurposed from unused civil nuclear credit dollars, which were part of the Democrats' infrastructure bill that passed, which was meant to give support to struggling U.S. reactors in the U.S. Good cause, noble cause, but something else happened in the Inflation Reduction Act is Congress passed a production tax credit for nuclear power plants. And lo and behold, that was the magic that the industry needed. We don't have any struggling, troubled reactors anymore in the United States, with the exception of Diablo Canyon in California, which will get funds from that program, and maybe a closed reactor in Michigan. So there's $6 billion that are there that can be repurposed. And Congress is suggesting that for this Nuclear Fuel Security Act, that be the source of this funding. So when they come back after recess, we'll be back up on the Hill and really encouraging Congress to move forward, pass it in the House, bring a bill go through reconciliation and bring the bill to the president for signature before year's end.
So this bill itself has two components. One is to increase the national stockpiles of uranium material, and the other component is to create an enrichment regime that will allow the material to be used in reactors. Is that my understanding correct?
The way that Senators Manchin and Barrasso structured this, and it has carried over to the House side, is they believe the best way to incentivize more conversion, enrichment, and uranium capacity being stood up in the United States is to have that government procurement program provide the catalyst. So it would be the purchase of U.S. origin uranium conversion enrichment in support of that strategic objective. So that's kind of that's why it really is an expansion of the strategic uranium reserve that we benefited from. For as the uranium producers, there's positive and negative to that. Positive, we have a lot more eyes and a lot more urgency behind the bigger problem. But the negative is it's a bigger problem, so it's more expensive. Our program was $75 million expended this year on 1 million pounds of U.S. origin uranium. Now the program is looking like a $2.7 billion program. So that just adds to the challenge a bit. It's in this sort of fiscal responsibility push in the House.
But in order to break the Russian monopoly, it's not a full monopoly, but the Russian stranglehold on uranium capacity, enrichment has to be a key component to this. Otherwise, you have uranium that needs to be enriched and still has to go over to Russia, right?
Yeah, and we have a real life example in one of our home states at UEC is Wyoming, where we're building a TerraPower small modular advanced reactor in southwestern Wyoming, and it uses what's known as high assay low enriched uranium, which is a little bit of a higher octane, higher enriched fuel for that type of a reactor. The problem is only the Russians were able to produce that type of fuel. So this is an example of what we can't fall prey to. So not only with advanced reactors, but with our large standard reactors, we just can't rely on Russia going forward. And frankly, we don't want to rely on China either. And we're in a bit of an interesting phase in the uranium market. And it is a conversion enrichment challenge, but it is also uranium, because we've got the Russians and the Chinese who share a very large border with the world's largest producer, Kazakhstan. And what we're finding is that they're taking very active steps to lock up most, if not all, of that production. So the Russians just increased their ownership of mines in Kazakhstan to at or over 50% of production. And the Chinese have done the same with joint ventures and large contracts and a global trading hub across the Kazakh border in China, which will be a draw on Kazakh uranium to China. Once it goes into China, it goes in a Chinese reactor. So, in the West, we're going to have to look for uranium resources that aren't controlled by Russia or China. Certainly, the biggest beneficiaries are Canada and the United States, but I would put Australia in there and some mines in Africa that aren't controlled by the Chinese. But Africa, as we all know from the headlines, has its own challenges right now.
Yes, definitely. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the Kazakhs control 40% of the uranium production in the world currently. Is that correct? So
That's
this would
right.
be
It's 57 million pounds, probably 57 to 60 million pounds annually. And I think they'll continue to be the world's largest producer. It's just really a question of how much of that uranium will make it to the West for our needs. And it's already become challenging with sanctions and secondary sanctions and financial sanctions on Russia. Exporting through St. Petersburg has become problematic. There's been a number of efforts to export through the Black Sea, through Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. It's feasible, it can be done. It's very expensive, and it's hard to do it at any sizable volume. So I think the West would be very smart to look to Western supplies for all these fuel cycle commodities. And on the uranium side, again, I think the resources of Saskatchewan in Canada and uranium resources in the Western United States, these will be some of the biggest beneficiaries as geopolitics are getting more complicated, not less.
Yeah, definitely. Before we move on to other topics, in the actual bill itself, how much of the money's being dedicated to building up the stockpiles versus creating enrichment capacity?
Yeah, to be detailed, to be determined. But the way the bill is structured is that the quantities, whatever the funding level is, will determine how much enriched uranium is bought by the government. And of that, there is a preference given to U.S. origin uranium. So that will be the first step: is can these volumes supporting these enriched uranium volumes be sourced from the United States? If they can't, if the capacity isn't there or it's contracted to utilities, then it opens up to friendly Western countries, which would include Canada. But there is a domestic uranium preference in it, and failing which would be friendly allied Western nations.
Now, given Canada's status as a free trade partner, are we exempt from that, or do we have to kind of wait to see if the U.S. states can cover first?
Yeah, the first preference is U.S. sources first. So, but obviously, if U.S. sources can't meet the total need, Canada is going to be, obviously, we'll look to Canada. But it's important to note that incredible trading ally, has been a major uranium supplier to the U.S. nuclear industry and will continue for many, many years. But Canada has its own sales objectives and has global markets. And a company like Cameco that I'm very familiar with from my days there has always been very globally diverse, with sales into Asia, Europe, the United States, Canada, South America, and going forward, the Middle East. So we can't just 100% rely on Canada. We can for a large degree, but we do have to have the U.S. industry step up. And I think you have a number of mines like UECs in Texas and Wyoming and other producers that have licensed permitted facilities that are restarting or on the verge of restarting, where you'll see American uranium be a meaningful share of not just U.S. utilities needs, but I think Western utilities needs as well. That geopolitical stability isn't just appealing to American consumers of uranium, but I think European and Asian as well.
Okay, well, earlier today, and it came across rather timely given that we were scheduled for this. It's almost like I planned it, but I didn't. The World Nuclear Association came out with a report stating that due to the greening of energy and the increased demand for nuclear, there had to be, and in their words, a considerable, consistent and cooperative program to get the fuel that is going to be needed for all these reactors.
Yeah.
Given that we are rapidly heading into a multipolar world, and we've kind of alluded to that with the Kazakhstan situation, with China and the Russians, is that a reasonable viewpoint for the World Nuclear Association to have? And how does that square with what's happened now with the Nuclear Fuel Security Act?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could view it either as a challenge or an opportunity. I mean, even without the Russian invasion of Ukraine and whatever happens with China and Taiwan, we had a very significant deficit of what the world consumes annually, which is now around 195 million pounds, and what we produce, which is around 144 million pounds. So 50, 60, 70 million pounds a year less than what we consume. The reason, that wasn't a problem is we were living off of secondary supplies and inventories, which are largely gone now. So even if there wasn't a bifurcation of the global nuclear fuel market, we would need to make significant investments in uranium conversion, enrichment, fabrication. With the events in Russia and moving away and onshoring some of these critical commodities and services, it just makes the challenge that much more. But I believe that those kind of market signals will result in the necessary mines, conversion facilities, and enrichment plants being built. I think just the passage of the Nuclear Fuel Security Act in conjunction with the Russian uranium ban will send a very strong signal that it's a good thing to make these kind of multi-billion-dollar investments. So WNA is correct. I mean, I think the annual meeting of the World Nuclear Association is in London every September, first week of September. They'll come out with the latest supply and demand forecast. It's produced every 2 years by that organization, and it'll show that we're not in a 3 to 4% annual growth rate on uranium requirements. It's going to be closer to 5 to 6, and I would encourage people. That's a very conservative study, by the way. It's produced by both utilities, producers, traders, analysts, and so it's I would say it's a conservative look at the supply and demand of uranium going forward. And if I had to say which there's different scenarios, low case, mid case, and high case. I think where we're headed is somewhere between the mid to the high case. It probably needs to be a new high case given the way things are developing. But it's a very we have a structural deficit in uranium today. It will be slow in getting a lot of these new mines into production. Not everyone's going to be like UEC, where we have production ready, assets that are ready to be turned on within months. A lot of mines are going to take that 6, 7, 8 years to go through the permitting and construction. And so I think we are headed into a supply shock period in the 2024, 25, 26. I think even utilities recognize that we're headed into that. For investors, this is a great scenario to invest into. But I also don't think, I don't see electric utility companies with nuclear power plants shutting down plants for lack of fuel. I think it will materialize, but the utilities that haven't been strategic and planned for this are going to have to pay up in a very tight market in this period. And that should be interesting to see that play out. But I think the uranium will be there. It's just we're going to see a lot higher prices, like we've seen already. Conversion enrichment prices have really taken off. Uranium is up 20% year to date, but still at $57 per pound is not quite at the point that incentivizes the real big growth in uranium production capacity that's needed.
Even if we do put those mines back onto production, how long before the enrichment capacity domestically is going to be available?
Well, I think that's got to happen very quickly, and I think the intent of the legislation in the U.S. and just countries looking at the growth of the nuclear energy industry, are making those investments already. Our Seoul enrichment plant in the United States is owned and operated by Urenco out of the UK. But in this facility in New Mexico is already embarking on a 15% capacity increase. And you got to remember, before the breakup of the Soviet Union, we were 100% reliant in the West for our needs. We really dialed back our growth and capacity expansions to make room for the Russians. So we're just needing to go back to that playbook again. And it's really just comes down to investment. If Urenco, Orano, GLE, Centrus, these companies that are in the enrichment business, they see that the market's there and we're not falling back on Russian supply 3-4 years down the road, the investments will come. And so I think it's important that these bills pass, and then that in combination with the strength of the global nuclear energy and uranium markets, we're going to get there. And for investors, it's a it's a wonderful thesis, and an industry that probably needs 8 to 10 new mines coming online between now and 2030. I can tell you where 2 are coming from, Texas and Wyoming, and with our company. But the companies that have either existing mines that can be restarted or fully permitted mines that are with an easier path to startup will really benefit and trade at a premium. But then we're also going to need to incentivize just breaking ground on new mines. And I think a great example of that is in in Niger and West Central Africa, where there are mines that can be brought on in that country, and one of which was slated to come on by 2025. And now with the coup, it's anyone's guess as to whether that impacts them or not. We have to see, and I think ultimately they will prevail, but it just shows you that it's not easy anywhere in the world to bring on new mine production, whether it's in the developed world or developing world. But I can tell you, we need those mines. So we've got to figure out a way to get that new mine capacity built, whether it's in Africa, Australia, US, or Canada.
Yeah, I was going to touch on the Niger situation because it's, although it's impacting the French nuclear industry more than the North American one, it's having an impact. All of a sudden now there's a question mark on the supply chain. And does that make the Nuclear Fuel Security Act even more important? Is it almost like the senators had a crystal ball that said, hey, wait a minute, we're one coup away from having problems?
You're giving them too much credit. I don't think their crystal ball was that clear, but it does absolutely support the objectives of the bill. And it is a global uranium market. So even though it disproportionately impacts the European market, and particularly the French, I believe it's been about 24-25% of EU imports. That impacts this deficit that we've been talking about, and it makes the gap even more, and it has to be made up. If it's not overcome, it needs to be made up somewhere else. So it's an interesting market where uranium prices as a result in the next 3 years could get to very interesting levels. We've never been a very efficient market like copper, gold, silver, other more mature commodities, where price signals immediately dictate production decreases or production increases. We have long lag times to get production offline when prices are falling, and we have long lead times to get production online as a result. So we don't tend to trade at the theoretical equilibrium market clearing price, for uranium. We trade way above it or way below it. And for investors, I think that's part of the allure, is that we're very much in a first inning of a bull market here. At $57 is really just the starting point.
Yeah, the market itself after Sprott had with the trust had pushed the market up, and it's been kind of sitting in a range here for a while, but it's been a much better range than it has been.
Well, I think it's interesting is that, for much of this year, Sprott has not been active as they've been trading at a discount to their NAV. So the price has increased 20% year to date, largely without the help of Sprott in recent months. So that tells you that this is that's a more robust situation. You have to ask yourself, if Sprott does come back in, and their discount to NAV will evaporate at some point, and they'll be back on the bid to buy uranium. They're going to come back to a market that doesn't have a lot of supply overhanging the spot market right now. So we could get into another, pretty dramatic rally in the spot price.
Wouldn't that be good? That would bring some mines back on the side really quick if we get over. Is $65 still the magic number to bring mines back online?
The better mines, I think, Cameco has brought its mines back with the knowledge that they now have contract portfolio that supports that threshold for them to restart. UEC is different. We're an unhedged seller, but we've said $60 sustainable. We're back in production very quickly in Wyoming, which has all been prepped for that restart, and within 12 months in Texas. But I think if you're bigger mines that have bigger capital lifts, it's probably 75, 80 would be a reasonable threshold. So we still have a ways to go. Some production will come on at 60, 65, but not anywhere near the 8 to 10 mines that we think the gap really is right now between now and 2030.
So Congress picks up the bill when they get back, and likelihood of its passing, a timeline is, what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's amazing when they come back in early September. Between that time and the end of the year, there aren't a lot of legislative days. I don't know, these guys don't work a lot of days, but there is a general feeling amongst folks on the Hill. Just spent time with the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee chair, staff, Manchin's people, met with the Nuclear Energy Institute, talked to a lot of folks on the House and Senate. I think that there's a belief that this has all the right elements to pass between now and the end of the year. But anything can happen in DC. The cost of everything is being scrutinized. So if there's a challenge, it's going to be in the cost piece of it. But Republicans and Democrats all agree that this is a priority. We can't just ignore 20% of our electricity supplies and fall prey to Russia and ultimately China. So I think the inertia is there for it to pass. We just need to get Congress back in DC and get it to the floor.
Perfect. Is there anything else we should be having an eye out for between now and the end of the year?
No, just we've talked about the fuel cycle, but there's also a lot of legislation that's being very supportive of small modular advanced reactors, and I know we've talked about that in past interviews, but you just continue to see more great news there. And we're down in South Texas, and the announcement that Dow Chemical is going to buy 4 small modular reactor units from X-Energy, build it it's called the Seadrift project. It's just south of Victoria, Texas, which is very near our Burke Hollow uranium project. But what a great example. They're a petrochemical company that needs uninterruptible 24/7 power, but they're being pushed to get that electricity in a more carbon-free manner, and nuclear ticks the box for them. So this is going to be the trend going forward. It's not necessarily the traditional utility companies that are going to be the buyers. There's a Polish copper company with a huge smelter in that country that's buying a small modular reactor from NuScale, another American company, for the same reason. So watch the SMR, small modular reactor front. That's a whole additional incremental source of demand for uranium that really hasn't been factored in yet.
Perfect. If people want to follow your organization and learn more, how would they do so?
Uranium Producers of America website is available, but uraniumenergy.com is probably a good source in our decks there. We have a lot of the supply and demand macro fundamental information in our decks, and also obviously speak to what we're doing in Texas, Wyoming, and and now in a very significant way in Saskatchewan. So I encourage you to hit the Uranium Energy website and see what we're up to.
Perfect. Look forward to having you back on as on a celebratory tour after this bill gets passed in Congress and signed off on.
I think that's an order. Thanks, Michael. I'll look forward to it.
Perfect. Thanks, Scott. The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.